This session is called Sectoral 2. Our first speaker is Marianne ZOTIN on opportunities and constraints represented by the heavy industry in the energy transition pathways. As you all know, if you're going to go zero or near zero net greenhouse gas emissions, this is one of the harder sectors, primarily because the technologies are pretty good, but very old and very fossil-y. So with that said, I'd like to turn it over to Marianne to give her a presentation.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to present our ongoing work on the role of the heavy industry in climate mitigation and energy transition pathways. My colleagues and I are from COPPE at Federal University of Rio. So our interest here, as John mentioned, lies on the industry sector, which is one of the most energy and emissions intensive, accounting for around 25% of direct emissions globally and roughly 28% of global final energy consumption. And here we have been particularly interested in the representation of the three most relevant sectors in this sense: the iron and steel sector, cement, and chemicals, which share these three basic features of demanding a high temperature heat, consuming energy sources for non-energy applications, and releasing not only energy-related but also process-related emissions. So the basic question that we have been asking ourselves, not only for this study, but also in parallel and in future studies, is how can materials affect climate change mitigation pathways? How can they alter technological trajectories when they are explicitly represented in integrated assessment models? And this work focuses on the heavy industry, thus the main bulk organic and inorganic materials, but of course, critical and specialty metals are in our radar as well. And please see also in poster sessions for later, work of our group focused on the copper demand in different scenarios. So regarding the methods, we're improving the industry subsectoral disaggregation in the COPPE model, which is an integrated assessment model based on perfect foresight, cost optimization, and we have detailed the cement, iron, steel, chemicals industries, and of course the non-energy use and the other industry sectors. And we used for now the SSP2 socioeconomic drivers to project materials demand regionally, but this is something that we also want to improve later. And I'm going to show next the technological representation of these subsectors and the result of preliminary runs we have made, in which we stress the model to see how it performed under different carbon taxes from 2025 on. And these are not final results. We will make carbon budget scenarios, make different assumptions over regional demand and materials use. But for the meantime, these runs are a proxy of how this model should respond to stringent carbon budgets and the role of these sectors in achieving them. And so I'm going to go very quickly through the main technologies we have been detailing in the supply side of our model. For the cement sector, we have traditional and CCS-based routes, as well as clinker substitution options. As for the iron and steel sector, we have also traditional and CCS options, but also, and those of which are combined with fossil and bio-based reductants. We also have integrated routes and innovative routes. Regarding the direct reduction technologies, we opted to separate iron and steelmaking technologies, where we again have traditional and CCS options, but also innovative hydrogen-based direct reduction. Iron sponge then can be further processed to steel in electric arc furnaces, where it can also process scrap steel scrap. And in the chemical sector, we have very similar options for both ammonia and methanol, where we have fossil and bio-based traditional CCS and also CCU options. And as for the HPC sector, that's where we have major improvements by representing ethylene, propylene, butadiene, and aromatics as main products, following the work of Camilo Oliveira, presented yesterday by Pedro Rochedo, an improvement made in our national integrated assessment model, BLUES. And here we have additional multi-product options such as tin cracking, but also some integration within the refinery sector and the co-production of propylene and aromatics in traditional refinery units. Again, we have bio-based and fossil fuel-based feedstocks, as well as CCU options through methanol-based routes. And we have also on-purpose dedicated options such as bioethanol dehydration, metathesis, methanol to olefins to aromatics. And finally, we also included some options to simulate refinery petrochemical integration, such as new FCC and catalytic reforming units producing propylene and aromatics, respectively. So again, these are preliminary global aggregate results. For the cement sector, we can see that as we increase carbon taxes, CCS becomes increasingly relevant. Coal dramatically reduces its share in heat generation, giving space to natural gas, coal with CCS, and biomass with CCS. As for the clinker to cement ratio, it gradually decreases to 70% and 68%, but we only see a further decrease with 200, 300 carbon dollars per ton of CO2. And in the iron and steel sectors, we see that the energy intensity declines gradually in all scenarios, but of course, much more in the more stringent scenario, reaching around 10 to 11 gigajoules per ton of steel in 2050. We also see that in lower carbon taxes, process efficiency is favorable, whereas in carbon taxes of $50, we see routes with CCS being deployed. And in the third scenario, we see also that the model is willing to pay for a higher share of secondary steel and for direct reduction with CCS. Going further, the chemical sector, carbon taxes lead to a higher share of steam methane reforming with CCS, and in hydrogen synthesis for ammonia production. But in methanol production, we see a different pattern. We see that here in blue, the deployment of CCU, here as carbon dioxide hydrogenation or CDH. And as we increase carbon taxes, we see a role of both CCU and CCS, and also a significant share of electrolysis in hydrogen production for these carbon dioxide hydrogenation. Finally, in the HPC sector, we see that the main structure of the industry does not change much. When we think about refinery co-production, on-purpose dedicated facilities, and multi-product technologies. But yeah, multi-product remain dominant, but as refinery output declines, on-purpose routes have to be deployed to compensate for this. And though the structure looks the same through all the scenarios, the share of bio-based feedstock here is increasingly higher with increasing carbon taxes. So when applying these carbon taxes, we see that the model chooses to build biorefineries that co-produce advanced biofuels and bionaphtha, which is a petrochemical feedstock. And regionally, this has a very different pattern as well. So wrapping up, there's of course lots of room for improvements. For example, performing budgets and LED scenarios, and mostly improving demand side representation. For example, considering intermaterial substitution, material efficiency measures, and indigenizing part of the material and within IAM sectors. But preliminary results show that there's a general global trend within scenarios. Regional comparative advantages clearly are driving very different energy transitions across the world. And I'll draw attention to the role of bio-based feedstock and the need to anticipate carbon dioxide removal technologies in some regions because of the difficulty to mitigate emissions in this sector. And mostly these preliminary results also show the importance of representing materials, energy, and climate interlinkages in integrated assessment models, both on the supply and demand sides, which is being tackled by several groups now, some of them in this session. And if we can grasp and represent these interlinkages, I think we'll be closer to understand the role of materials in climate mitigation scenarios, climate change mitigation scenarios. So thank you. I'll be glad to take any questions now. And this is where I stop.
Thanks very much for that very informative and efficient presentation. I think you covered a lot of bases and you were right on the 10-minute mark. So that was a fabulous start for the session. I also add you created not only a good body of knowledge, communicated a good body of knowledge from your own study, but created some linkages to other sectors and more integrative looks at the low carbon future, which will be picked up by other speakers in this very same session. So thank you very much for that, Arnie. Obviously for me, the regional, I know it's a short amount of time, but you were able to convince us that some of the regional differences were indeed, and that's one of your main conclusions, is not all countries, not all regions are the same in terms of decarbonizing the industrial sector. I also would add, obviously, Brazil, I think, is ahead of the class on, in my opinion. Some people may object in the biofuels, realistic assessments of biofuels as evidenced by the work of your team in the, for example, not to plug the EMF 33 study on advanced biofuels in the context of deep decarbonization. We'll now move on to Marianne's colleague to address another couple of difficult sectors to decarbonize. And that will be a talk by Eduardo Müller-Caceres, also from COPPE group, who will talk about a topic I found quite interesting, and that is synergies between aviation, one hard sector to decarbonize, and maritime, another hard sector to decarbonize, goals, co-production of aviation and shipping alternative fuels. I think if we're going to truly go very low, the world is going to have to come up with creative, synergistic, cross-cutting strategies like this one. Eduardo, take it away.
As introduced by John, this is a work on the synergies between the aviation and shipping sector in terms of decarbonization. And we're looking here specifically the case of Brazil using the BLUES model. And the whole team is here. We're also from COPPE. The whole team is from COPPE, just as the previous presentation. So the main motivation here, the motivation for this work is the existence of liquid fuel routes that co-produce shipping fuels that are suited to the aviation sector and to the shipping sector, just like some fossil routes. So we have here, for example, several bio and electro routes that are focused to produce jet fuel, meaning kerosene, but because of the nature of the process, similarly to what happens in petroleum refineries, there's a co-production of diesel and heavy fractions, so fuels that are suited to shipping. And therefore, our research question here is to what extent there is a synergy in the case of Brazil between these two sectors. We basically wanted to see if by decarbonizing aviation, we would automatically decarbonize shipping because of these low added value co-products. So very briefly, we're using the national IAM from COPPE for Brazil, which is the BLUES model. It is split into 5 regions. And basically, this slide here is showing the original routes from the first slide translated into the BLUES model. So we have the fossil routes here in gray, bio routes in green, and hydrogen-based routes in yellow. And of course, we also have here naphtha and LPG, for example, but we're focusing here on the right side of the figure on the fuels that are suited to aviation, which are basically kerosene and drop-in renewable kerosene, and shipping fuels that are more diverse. In terms of scenarios for this study, we have 4 scenarios and 3 sensitivity cases. In the first 3 scenarios, we have current policy views of Brazil, but considering different assumptions in terms of the international goals for shipping and aviation. And finally, we have this B2C scenario, which is a well below 2 scenario for Brazil. So there's a climate policy not only for Brazil, but also for shipping and aviation, international shipping, international aviation. The IATA scenario considers only a goal for aviation with no restrictions for shipping. The IMO scenario, also a current policy view of Brazil, but with a climate goal for shipping and not for aviation. And the IATA IMO scenario is basically combining the 2 previous ones. Furthermore, we have 3 sensitivity cases here. In this pink one, we're basically considering that the demand for kerosene would double because Brazil has a large potential of being a renewable kerosene exporter. And the other 2 scenarios are basically sensitivity cases for the cost of biomass to liquids. Typically, our model chooses a lot this technology. And what we did in the sensitivity cases was to be less optimistic regarding this technology to see, for example, in terms of gains of scale, to see what would be the impact of having a less economic biomass to liquids in terms also of other routes. So these are our scenarios. And now entering already the results, we have 2 slides for results, one for aviation, another one for shipping. Looking at aviation, we have on the left the total energy consumption in 2020, and the other bars represent each of the scenarios I was talking about. So if we look at the IATA scenario, for example, there is a restriction for aviation, and because of that, the model chooses the biokerosene route based on biomass to liquids, and almost all the energy demand is met by this technology. In the IMO scenario, there's no restriction for the aviation emissions, and therefore the energy supply is almost completely fossil. If we look at the combination of these 2 scenarios, biokerosene is still very important, but a considerable amount of kerosene is coming from HVO diesel plants that co-produce considerable amounts of kerosene when producing HVO. The result is similar for the sensitivity analysis with higher demand. And in this 6 bar here, the IATA IMO with small BTL, we have less optimistic assumption for BTL, and therefore the biokerosene based on BTL has a smaller participation, and the oligomerization route, which is the alcohol to jet route based on ethanol, becomes very important. In the case of deep decarbonization scenarios, the results change significantly because Brazil needs negative emissions, and this need for negative emissions is met by the large-scale deployment of BECCS. Therefore, we go back in a certain way to biomass to liquids, but this time shown in yellow here because it is combined with CCS. If we have a look now in the results for shipping, again, the total energy demand for 2020 is here on the left. Of course, in the IATA scenario, we don't have any restrictions for shipping emissions, and therefore shipping continues to be fossil. But when we start to restrict the emissions from shipping, we see that the model chooses vegetable oils to meet this demand. First, it chooses this purple, which is shown in purple here, SVO, which is straight vegetable oils. But because of the technical limit of this option, the model also produces the hydrogenated version of the oils, which are which is HVO. So that's why we saw in the previous slide an amount of kerosene coming also from this route. When we look at deep decarbonization pathways, again, the last two bars, we see that the results changes completely. And that's again because of the need for negative emissions, for CCS. But interestingly, this fuel is not coming, this fuel for shipping in pink here is not coming from kerosene plants, but from road diesel plants. Actually, the amount of road diesel is higher than the demand for kerosene, and the biobunker is therefore coming from road diesel and not from kerosene, as we expected in the beginning. And this is basically the conclusion of our work. Is there a synergy between the sectors? Yes, there is conceptually, but because of the different sizes of these two sectors in Brazil, because of the fact that shipping is larger than aviation, the synergy is not verified in practice, because shipping has to recur to other energy sources, mainly SVO and HVO. And in deep decarbonization scenarios, the residual fractions, the co-production fractions, are coming from road diesel and not kerosene plants. So that is the key takeaway from our work. Thank you very much, and I hope I was on time.
Exactly on time once again. So thank you for that. Within 20 seconds of 10 minutes, actually, on the low end of the allowed presentation time. Again, very informative, instructive thing with great depth in biofuels and looking at the synergy. Again, I think we'll have to look at a lot of synergies. Some of them may bear a lot of fruit, others not so much. But I do think this is interesting. I was sitting here reminiscing about my first big mentor, my postdoc advisor, Professor Alan Mann, who actually constructed the first refinery model that was then taken up by the private sector, where I learned about fractions of distillation in refinery operations, which I think is even more important as we go to these low emission scenarios, because as your presentation indicates, we can't kind of throw the a third of the barrel away because it would have created emissions. We should try hard to find any way we can to use that in a sustainable, that fraction also in a sustainable manner. That's just my own personal take. If you have a question, and I see right on cue, Volker Cray, our friend from IASA. Volker.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Eduardo. Quick question, which I also posted in the chat. My understanding is you did cover in your analysis also hydrogen and electricity routes to bunker fuels, but they didn't pop up in any of the results. Is that due to very favorable bioenergy conditions in Brazil? So is that specific to Brazil, would you say that? Or is that a generalizable finding that would also hold for many other countries from your perspective?
Well, yeah, definitely these results are, thank you, Volker, for the comments and the question. But that definitely, these results refer only to Brazil, and we could have some kind of variation for other regions. But I would say that our results, the results favor biomass because of cost. Basically, we didn't put any constraints on the penetration of ammonia, hydrogen, methanol. These are all also represented. So this is one thing. And also another thing that favors biomass in our model, especially in the deep decarbonization scenarios, is the need for CCS. So the model has a preference for biomass routes in the two last bars, as I was referring to earlier, because of the need for CCS. So yeah, I think that would be it.
Great.
Eduardo, if I can add something, I don't know if I can add something on the answer.
Go ahead.
If
If it's follow-on, go ahead.
Just complementing, I think that also we have the ship pattern in Brazil, the type of navigation and the type of ships that we have in Brazil. So most of the ships in Brazil are for bulk materials and for tankers. And this demands the type of fuels and the type of and also the lifetimes of the ships. So when you see the period of analysis, we are going to 2050, and most of the ships in Brazil are transporting soybeans and iron and oil, so crude oil. I think this also explains a lot of these results.
Great, thank you. For that comment, Alexander is also a co-author on this paper, so he knows of what he speaks in this regard. So I see we have one more hand up and just enough time for David McCollum, who's now moved from IASA to EPRI to Oak Ridge National Labs. David.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, John. Thanks, Eduardo. Yeah, Eduardo, you sort of mentioned it. I posted a question in the chat. It was also about the regional versus global nature of the analysis. And I was just, so it's a bit of a clarifying question, but also just if you had any thoughts about it. So was the Blues model here somehow embedded in the global framework or soft linked in a way? I'm just wondering because of I guess there's a massive export opportunity here in Brazil as well, if it is the case, and I don't know if it is, but this is what I'm wondering, if in Brazil these routes to producing synthetic aviation and marine fuels are cheaper than elsewhere in the world, maybe. Then these demand numbers that you showed across the different scenarios could actually be much higher, or could even vary by scenario depending on which scenario that you were running. And I'm curious if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, exactly. That was the idea of one sensitivity analysis that we had. I mean, the total energy was the same across scenarios, except for one, in which we were considering kerosene exports. So that's exactly what we were trying to look at, and I agree that Brazil has a large potential to become a synthetic fuel exporter. And maybe also worth clarifying that although it is a national model, Blues, we adapted it to deal with part of the international transport demand. So definitely what we're looking at here is not only the domestic demand, but also 50%, let's say, of the international demand in the relevant routes too. So I think that would be it. Thank you.
At this point, I'd like to introduce Paul STEGMANN from Utrecht University, who will talk about making integrated assessment models circular. I think a big challenge for everybody doing, particularly in an ultra-low carbon greenhouse gas world, is bringing concepts from life cycle assessment or life cycle modeling into our normal energy systems and integrated assessment models. For more on that, I'd like to introduce Paul STEGMANN. Paul.
Hey, thank you, John. And hi, everyone, and thanks for joining today. This is my first IMT conference, and actually would have loved to meet you in person. But to give you some background, my work actually focused mainly on material flows and the circular economy, something that starts to play more and more of a role in integrated assessment models, as we also saw in the presentation of Marianne in the beginning. And my presentation today will give you some insights into the climate change mitigation pathways for the global plastic sector based on biomass use, recycling, and CO2 sequestration in products. Both the bioeconomy and the circular economy are expected to play an important role in climate change mitigation. However, in the integrated assessment model so far, they mainly focus on the energy use and largely ignore materials and circular strategies. So what we miss out here is what happens on the lower part of the circle. IMs often miss out on the fate of oil or biomass that is found in products, on how long they are in use, and what happens to them at the end of their life. So consequentially, they also miss out on the downstream mitigation strategies in the use and end of life phase. And to analyze those downstream mitigation options, we have to add materials and waste management technologies to IAMS. We started at PBL and Utrecht University to add the chemical and plastic sector to the image timer model. And this chemical sector is not just the largest industrial energy consumer, but also expected to increase its emissions and oil use significantly in the coming years. Plastics are a key output of the sector and globally also the fastest growing bulk material. And biomass and recycling are two very important strategies to reduce this sector's growing emissions. So the circular bioeconomy concept could play a particularly important role here. My goal was to understand the greenhouse gas emission mitigation potential of biomass use, recycling, but also of carbon sequestration in products for the plastic sector. And for that purpose, I created a plastic integrated assessment model, short PLIA, which is part of the image integrated assessment model. And PLIA covers the extraction of fossil and bio-based resources as part of the image modules, the upstream chemical production of feedstock and intermediates, then the plastic polymer production and the transformation of those polymers into plastic products, and then finally the use of those plastics in different sectors, and then the end of life of these products. And here we include mechanical recycling, chemical recycling via pyrolysis, waste to energy, and landfilling. These graphs here show the projections of annual plastic production, waste generation, and the plastic stocks in use by sector for an SSP2 baseline. We basically see a doubling of production until 2050 in the left graph, which is mainly driven by China and other emerging and developing economies. And even more of a tripling until the end of the century. So without drastically changing our plastic consumption patterns, we stand in front of an enormous challenge. We differentiate between 8 different plastic sectors. For each of these sectors, we define the lifetime distribution of these products, which then tells us how long a product is actually in use and when it becomes waste. And that provides the other two graphs here, the plastic waste generation in the middle and the plastic stocks in use on the right. The model results provide us with the annual flows of plastics from production to the end of life, like here in the Sankey diagram for an SSP2 baseline in the year 2050. And in this baseline scenario, waste to energy becomes the clearly dominating waste treatment technology, while recycling does not really increase and also biomass is just taken up a little bit. In another scenario, we added a C2 price, which is in line with the 2-degree target of the Paris Climate Agreement, so the RCP 2.6 scenario. And this leads to an increase in biomass use. And we also see that waste to energy plays a much smaller role than, and that recycling is increasing. But what we also see is an enormous amount of plastics going to landfills. And that is because in properly managed landfills, plastics can stay sequestered for centuries or even thousands of years, depending on the plastic type. So therefore, with a high CO2 price, the model really likes landfilling as a waste treatment method as it's cheap and it avoids greenhouse gas emissions. We also analyzed the circular economy scenario to contrast that, in which we phase out landfilling and improve both mechanical and chemical recycling. And this leads to a strong shift to recycling and therefore also to a drastic reduction in primary plastic production here on the left, and also a big difference in landfill plastics, as you can see when comparing both scenarios. I will go back and forth a bit. But what is the impact of these scenarios on the emissions of the plastic sector? Here we show on the positive side all the annual carbon input to the plastic sector by energy carrier, including also the waste that is generated each year and can be used as a resource. And then on the negative side, all the additions to plastic stocks in products, but also in landfills or dumps. And then the lines show the actually emission balance, the annual one of these scenarios. Here we see the SPO2 baseline again, which has the highest emissions compared to the others, mainly because of the major role of waste to energy and a continued high share of fossil energy carriers. But all scenarios with a C2 price, the one on the left here, show a strong reduction in emissions. On the one hand, this is driven by the decarbonization of the electricity sector, which is in blue here, which is eventually fully based on renewables. Then the fact that waste to energy only plays a very small role is an important factor. By either recycling or landfilling plastics sector can avoid a large parts of its emissions. And waste to energy is becoming increasingly unattractive at higher CO2 prices. And producing the heat and electricity via waste incineration does not really make up for this emissions cost anymore, particularly after 2030, when heat and electricity sector are greener and greener. But also the increasing use of biomass plays a very important role in reducing the emissions. A key difference, though, between the scenarios here is the amount of landfill plastics. As I already indicated before, from a purely greenhouse gas mitigation perspective, landfilling bio-based plastics seems attractive, as it can sequester plastic for centuries and turns eventually in sector even to a net carbon sink. And this is when we just apply a CO2 price without any other measures. But it also has trade-offs. If we look here at the energy use of the plastic sector, we see that the second scenario with the CO2 price alone does not really reduce the energy use compared to the baseline. It's basically almost the same in 2050, and by 2100, it's just, I think, lower, around 8% lower. And here we see a big trade-off with the circular economy goals, but also with other criteria like land use and the impacts of biomass and plastic reduction, which is affecting water, soil, and air quality. A circular economy scenario on the right, though, significantly reduces the energy use by 30% until 2050 and by almost 50% by 2100, by switching more and more to waste as a resource. We saw that the circular economy scenario has the lowest energy use, but it also achieves the lowest emissions before 2050, as you can see when following the dotted line in the third graph. However, at the same time, it phases out landfilling and has less total biomass use. And in that way, it takes away a cheap carbon sink. And furthermore, recycling becomes also less beneficial the greener primary plastic reduction gets. So therefore, this scenario does not really achieve that deep emission reduction in the long term, but it does very well so on the short term. And here lies the strength of our model. We can show the trade-offs between the circular economy and the climate change goals. We created an additional scenario which combines the circular economy strategy with a higher biomass use. And this circular bioeconomy scenario seems like a promising compromise between the second and the third one. It achieves the deepest emission reduction throughout the entire time period by still phasing out landfilling and significantly reducing the energy use, even though not to that extent as the circular economy scenario alone. And with this, I'm already coming to my conclusions. We saw that without drastic change in our consumption of plastics, we will face a doubling of plastic demand by 2050 and more than a tripling by 2100. We saw that biomass use, a decarbonized electricity sector, but also reduction of waste to energy are all important contributors to mitigating the emissions in the plastic sector. And these strategies are driven by the CO2 price. But we also saw that the CO2 price alone does not really reduce the energy use in the sector and is moreover leading to increased landfilling in many regions. So we have a trade-off with the circular economy goals, but also with other environmental impacts that we didn't look too much into, but which is clear when high energy use is present. And finally, adopting a circular economy strategy in combination with the CO2 price would significantly reduce this energy use, but also achieve even deeper emission reduction up until 2050. However, in the long term, we saw it has less emission mitigation potential as it has less potential of negative emissions achieved by bio-based plastics production and their sequestration in products and landfills. And therefore, we had this idea of a circular bioeconomy scenario, which is a promising compromise between climate and circular economy targets. And it can achieve a net carbon sink around 2070 in our projections, while at the same time still phasing out landfilling and reducing the energy use of the plastic sector. Overall, integrating materials in the circular economy and the circular economy in IAMS opens the door to very many new research opportunities. As my example for plastic showed, it allows to analyze trade-offs, but also co-benefits between emission mitigation and material efficiency. And in general, it helps us to understand the material requirements and the impact that goes along with mitigation measures. Think, for example, of materials that are necessary for electric cars or solar panels. So with this, I would like to conclude and thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Paul, for that great presentation, again, showing the value of increasing detail and integration, even within integrated assessment models. I don't see any electronic hands, but I noticed we have 3 excellent questions in the chat box. So I'd like to encourage, now 4, I'd like to encourage the people in the chat box to speak up. Otherwise, I could read those questions, starting with Dirk-Jan van den Ven.
I was just wondering if you have also taken account the emissions and the energy production process. So, and whether you think this may shift the balance in favor of the circular economy model, as there are quite some emissions in the production and distribution of energy itself.
It was a bit difficult to understand you, but I also saw now your question in the chat box, so I think that helps. Yeah. But yes, we included the emissions of energy production. That's part. It's basically coming from the wider image timer model that includes the energy production and its emissions, and it's an input to my module for plastics.
Okay.
Next, we have Neil Grant. Neil.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Really interesting presentation. I just was interested in that trade-off that we see sort of between sequestration, carbon sequestration and energy use and reducing energy demand. I was just wondering whether you'd considered modelling CCS as part of waste to energy plants as a sort of alternative sequestration option, and whether you think that would change the balance in your results much.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would make waste energy more attractive and probably go at the cost of landfilling. But so far we didn't include that yet. The same goes for CCS and utilization in the plastic production, which is another mitigation route. We just included biomass, recycling, and of course, lowering the energy use. But CCS is not part of this model yet, besides in the biomass production of the wider image timer model. But within plastics, we unfortunately didn't have it yet. But indeed, I think future developments will include CCS, not just for waste to energy, but also for the plastic production as another mitigation path.
Great. Next, I see Miles Perry. Miles.
Yes, hello. I think my question is quite similar. If I think about, the future of plastic, I always imagine a future with lots of plastic, because in the real world, perhaps with incomplete carbon markets, you might find oil demand shrinking from energy, due to electric vehicles or heat emissions trading systems or whatever, and therefore diversification into plastic. I was wondering if you'd considered that sort of scenario. Thanks.
So let me again. You think that that basically plastic will be less in the future because oil is produced less?
Well, no, more that it would be more. It would be more because
okay.
The oil
because oil need to switch to another source.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's actually a strategy. You can also see that the chemical sector is trying to find different markets. And since products have a longer lifetime and are not directly emitted, it's of course also a bit more promising regarding emissions. So I could imagine that actually plastics become, maybe even cheaper, and might also be necessary in several sectors, for example, to make more lightweight vehicles. So I could see in some sectors that plastics use might be increasing even more than it already does. But I also see the other, more driven from the public and NGOs to reduce plastic use, for example, in packaging as much as possible. So I think we have diverging demand pathways, and I would foresee that for some sectors it will increase even further, and for others it will hopefully decrease. And that's another thing which probably has to be analyzed a bit further, is where do plastics have an advantage? Because, for example, they provide more lightweight characteristic of products, and where can they be used? Can they be replaced by something else which is more environmentally friendly? And for that, we also need to integrate other production options like glass, or, for example, for packaging and or paper, cardboard, and let this within an integrated assessment model analyze what is the best way for a certain service that plastic currently provides. Right now, this is not the case yet.
Next, we have a question by Alexander Siklo again. Alexander.
It's just a quick question, and thanks for the nice presentation. It is about, are you considering the chemical recycling in existing oil refineries? Because some refineries are considering that, to use refiners and revamp the refiners in order to waste recycling and to make the chemical recycling inside the refiners. I think somehow the complementation of the questions from Miles Perry, a way of oil refiners to be revamped, to be used as a site for chemical recycling, and perhaps this can increase the use of chemical recycling in your model.
Indeed, I think in general that's a development also realized when reading some strategies of the chemical interest groups, that they very much focus on chemical recycling in the future as a business model for them. So indeed, in my model right now, chemical recycling does play a very big role, but I could imagine that the chemical sector will push for this. But on the other hand, it really depends on the kind of chemical recycling you do. Pyrolysis is a quite energy intensive process that I used here, but there are much more specialized chemical recycling routes that focus on specific plastic types. And these are, quite innovative and not really available to include in the model yet because the data is not publicly available. So I agree, there will probably be a different development, a different driver that I didn't include yet in my model. So I indeed expect that chemical recycling will take up more than it maybe is projected in my model. But on the other hand, mechanical recycling is readily available, it works, and it's usually less energy intensive. But for products that require really high quality plastics, I think chemical recycling will in the future play a bigger role. But for lower quality applications, I would foresee that mechanical recycling stays the dominant technology.
Great. To wrap up this part of the program, I'd like to call on Gunnar Luderer again. Gunnar.
Yeah, great stuff, Paul. We work on similar stuff on the WEYANT side, but we are quite as far as you are. I think it's very impressive and very logical to integrate the energy modeling and the material modeling. That's really cool. So the point that I want to make is I really think there's a very important policy dimension. You kind of cut to it with this question of how to deal with landfills. But it also has a carbon pricing dimension, because the big question is how do we, I would say, like how do you regulate the carbon contained in materials? If you do it upstream, you kind of apply the carbon price to the fossil carbon that goes into your materials, then you have like a different incentive structure than if you somehow only apply the carbon pricing to the carbon that goes out of your exhaust stream. And that's a very important issue, and maybe playing around with that would be quite helpful. And in the end, the question is whether or not you credit the landfills for the carbon sink, or whether you treat it as if it was released to the atmosphere, the carbon.
Indeed, and actually also played around with it. Of course, if you would tax it directly on the production level, alternative feedstocks like biomass would play a bigger role. But then also waste to energy plays quite a big role. So you don't incentivize a long-term use of these plastic products. So I went with the strategy that you tax the CO2 where it is emitted. In that case, means waste to energy will be taxed. And I didn't give a specific bonus to landfilling, but it benefits just by not emitting it. So it is already in that way, liked by the model. But I indeed, on a policy level, I expect that landfilling will be reduced in the future. And the question is just how much goes to recycling, how much goes to waste to energy. And that really depends how much is invested in improving circular product design and the recycling industry itself.
Great. On that note, I think we need to move on. Thanks very much, Paul, for your talk and stimulating 5 excellent questions regarding it. Next, we move to even further integration and cross comparison, I believe. Xia Yu from Pacific Northwest Labs Joint Global Change Research Institute will present her talk on race to zero transition pathways of individual and industrial sectors in a 1.5 degrees C future. Xia.
Thank you, John, for the introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. So as some of the previous speakers probably mentioned this one, the industry sector currently accounts for roughly like a third of global greenhouse gas emissions, and is really critical to global decarbonization. So just to better understand the industry sector transitions and technology pathways in this kind of net zero scenarios, we added some kind of additional detail to the GCAM, the Global Change Analysis Model. So pretty much most of you probably know that GCAM is an open source global integrated assessment model with this desegregation into 32 different geopolitical regions. It has fully coupled energy economy and agriculture systems. And over the years, we actually expanded spatial and temporal resolution of the model. So we have now like 50 state model for USA, like GChem USA, or 31 province model for China, GChem China. In today's presentation, I'm going to focus on the industry sector in the core GChem model, but it is worth noting that we actually are adding similar, and in most cases, like more granularity to industry sector in GChem China and GChem USA as well. So traditionally, like in GChem, we only have like 3 different sectors for industry, cement, fertilizer, and other industry. And in this process, we added 6 additional sectors in there, including iron and steel, chemicals, aluminum. We separate aluminum from non-ferrous metals simply because it's highly electricity based. And we also have like construction, mining energy use, and agriculture energy use. So together, this kind of like 9 different like specific or disaggregated industry sector accounts for about roughly 70% of global industry greenhouse gas emissions. And each of the industry subsectors includes both kind of detailed representation of conventional technologies as well as some kind of new technologies. I'm not going to go through each of sector in detail, but just taking the iron and steel sector as example here, which we include like 8 different competing technologies for steel production, that including some of the existing technologies such as blast furnace, basic oxygen furnace, and electric arc furnaces with scrap metal or direct reduced iron. But we also have some kind of new technologies such as like blast furnace with hydrogen, which kind of more like a bridging technology, but also technologies that can fully decarbonize the steel production, like hydrogen-based DRI. So like we have a kind of quite diverse set of technology considered for most of the industry sectors presented here. The other thing to know that is all the technologies in the detailed industry model in GChem are vintaged, and the retirement of the facilities are considered with 2 different retirement function, profit shutdown, like basically when you're not making profit, we're shutting down industry facility, and also a lifetime. And for most of sectors, like the heavy industry sector, we have something like 40 years, but for steel, I think we have 30 years in this study. And the off-road sectors have roughly 20-year lifetime in the model. So just to understand the role of industry sector transition in kind of 1.5 degree consistent pathways, we asked ourselves a couple of questions like, how would individual industry transform? And how would like transition pathway differ by region? What are the role of key technologies like hydrogen or CCS? And to what extent like capital stock inertia affect the overall transition? So just to answer these questions, we actually look into a couple of different scenarios. Like there are 2 core scenarios, like the reference, like no policy reference versus 1.5 degree, but we're also looking into a few sensitivity tests here. Basically, these are kind of the things raised by stakeholders in discussion, like the role of CCS, and there is quite uncertain, and we heard different opinion about that. And there are also kind of questions about capital stock inertia, delayed retirement, and different kind of socioeconomic pathway, which is mostly affecting the demand side. And however, in today's presentation, I'm not going to go into any of the sensitivity scenarios given the timeline. I'm mostly going to focus on the 2 main scenarios here. So in like a 1.5 degree future, global like total carbon emissions decrease from roughly like 40 gigaton today to like nearly 0 in 2050. And industry sector in particular reduces like CO2 emission by over 90% in the next 3 decades, like from roughly 12 gigaton in 2020 to less than 1 gigaton in 2050. And we actually see it reaches 0 like around 2060. However, like not all the industry contribute equally. Cement and steel sector, although like they can significantly reduce CO2 emissions by roughly like 70 and 90% respectively in the next 3 decades, still have significant residual emissions that will need to be offset by negative emissions from other sectors. Whereas like we see chemicals, mostly due to the use of biofuel feedstocks and also CCS used in the upstream biofuel production, have some opportunities to be fully decarbonized. So this kind of continuous like industry sector transformation is driven by really rapid phase out of fossil fuels, especially without CCS, and also a shift from fossil fuel to low carbon technologies. And we've seen that the sheer fossil fuels used in the industry decreases from roughly like 70% today to less than 30% in 2050. And pretty much the majority of the remaining fossil fuel facilities need to be equipped with CCS. And at the same time, like we see increased electrification in industry sector and reaching something like more than 50% in 2050 and roughly like 66% by 2100. And this also kind of accompanied by the rapid decarbonization in the power sector. So you see this kind of low carbon versus high carbon electricity that's basically reflecting the changes in the power sector. And for the high temperature heat that cannot be like easily electrified, we also use like CCS or hydrogen to fill in the gap. So for example, like the hydrogen use in industry reaches roughly like 20% around 2050-ish. So the industry sector like can be decarbonized like by using a really diverse set of strategies, like including improving energy efficiency, material efficiency, fuel switching, CCS or hydrogen biomass. But they are really specific to each sector or each region. So just as example, we only focus on the transition pathway for the iron and steel sector here, as it's one of the most energy intensive industries. So we see significant transformation in the iron and steel sector in both supply and demand side in the 1.5 degree pathways. In terms of demand, we see the global steel production peaks around 2055 at about 2,300 million tons of steel, and then gradually declining in the second half of the century. There are three different underlying dynamics driving this trend. And first, I think the increase in the first half century is mostly driven by emerging economies like India, Africa, and Southeast Asia, as demand for infrastructure in these regions are still increasing. And so the demand for steel intensive products are also increasing in these regions. And second, we see like China, the largest steel manufacturer today, peaks is steel production in the near term and actually declines to something like 700 million tons of steel production by mid-century. For most of the developed economies like Korea or Japan or US, EU, the steel demand kind of saturated in our model assumptions, and then so kind of leveling off and gradually declining over time. So just combining of different trends across different regions, that's kind of giving us the overall trend. And the one thing to note here, the scenarios I'm showing here are not considering material efficiency. In some of the material efficiency consideration, different study, we looked into regional specific material efficiency measures that could reduce steel demand by like 18 to 27% further down, like across different regions. And in terms of technology, the dominant technology of blast furnace today will be roughly like phased out by mid-century and will be replaced by a different set of technologies, including increased electric arc furnace with scrap, hydrogen DRI, and as well as like CCS with electric arc furnace or blast furnaces. And one thing to note that even we see roughly like doubling in electric arc furnace with scrap metal in this study, but our overall scrap use, I think, is a little bit less than 800 million tons of scrap. Is still kind of, in general, on the lower end of the literature projects on the availability of the scrap metal. The other thing to know that is like global industry CO2 declines significantly in all the regions. However, there are regional dynamics. The transition pathways different across regions. And we see that like for some of the regions, like especially the least developed regions, for example, East and Western Africa, due to their current low level of industrialization at present, have significant potential for economic growth and industry expansion. As a result, their industrial CO2 emissions actually continue to rise in the next several decades, even in 1.5 degree scenarios, because really low base. Whereas most of the developed regions nearly reach zero or near zero, like CO2 emissions in the industry sector in the 1.5 degree scenarios. So I think just coming to the final slides. So we do see like that decarbonizing industry is challenging, but could be feasible, like just using a combination of different technology or policy approaches. And however, I think the mitigation pathways would vary across regions and across sectors, given the heterogeneity of the industry sector. And some of kind of current work we're doing or next steps, like we're doing some kind of continued improvement to the model as of now, like adding new sector, improved sector resolution. Like I think we're breaking out like pulp and paper, food processing, and some of other non-metallic minerals right now. And we're also trying to add material flows and kind of starting from iron and steel sector and cement sector in there, and also looking into intersector linkages and also trade across regions. With that, I will turn back to John and hope I'm still on time.
Great. Oh, perfect. Great talk again. Lots of content very efficiently presented. Himan Ceramidas, do you want to ask your question?
I can ask it, yes. Well, very interesting talk. Yeah, thank you. I see a lot of steel with hydrogen, DRI with hydrogen emerging, and very little, well, comparatively very little CCS. So my question is, do you allow retrofit of CCS on existing capacities? And is this option really more expensive than producing steel with new hydrogen, new capacities with hydrogen?
Well, we actually do not allow retrofit in the steel facility. That's one of the reasons. But also, I think there's regional dynamics. Like for US, the dominant one is actually electric arc furnace with scrap metal. The hydrogen DRI are coming from some new regions. Like I think steel is Korea is one of the regions with a lot of hydrogen DRI, and then I think India, like one of the some of the emerging economy also use a lot of new hydrogen facility. So there are definitely regional dynamics. It's not universal.
Great. With that said, since our final talk is on hydrogen, I suggest this is a great transition perhaps into that. This presentation will be by Patrick O'Rourke from the University of Maryland. I assume the new Sustainability Center there in conjunction with colleagues at JICRI and ExxonMobil Research and Engineering. I would say for most of us, we spent about 5 years, many of us, least of which is me, about 5 years trying to get the world woke to the fact that electric vehicles were a real thing and could be a major thing. And as soon as that mission was accomplished, people said, well, if you like electric vehicles, how about hydrogen vehicles? So it's been quite a rapid switch, if I could borrow that project name from it. So I'd like to call on Patrick to present his talk on examining supply and demand drivers of hydrogen deployment in energy transition scenarios. Patrick.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. Special thanks also to Haywan, Paige, Brian, Jay, and Paul, my co-authors. All right. So part of the motivation for this work was actually looking at the IPCC scenario database itself. So here we see final energy coming from electricity on the left and hydrogen on the right for 2050, with CO2 emissions on the x-axis, scenarios that are less than 1.5 degree peak warming are in pink, and blue are scenarios between 1.5 C and 2. And I think, the left graph shows a story that we're all pretty familiar with. Lower emissions are going to be associated with lower temperatures, which are associated also with higher percentage of total final energy coming from electricity. But on the right, we noticed, the pattern didn't seem as clear and it deserved more inspection. So we also looked at hydrogen production. So this is the same kind of graph here, except for on the y-axis is now hydrogen production by various different means. So in the top left, you see, hydrogen production in total does seem to have some kind of pattern associated with decarbonization and larger amounts of hydrogen being used. And this pattern somewhat exists also for biomass production on the top right. But in terms of electricity-based hydrogen on the bottom left and fossil-based hydrogen on the bottom right, the pattern didn't seem as clear. So overall motivating questions, though, were how does the scale of hydrogen deployment compare to other potential energy carriers in energy transition scenarios? In what sectors does hydrogen preferentially deploy? And what is the resulting mix, as well as how do these questions and answers depend on various assumptions about supply and demand for hydrogen. A few things out of scope for this work include long duration electricity storage, which is definitely, a hydrogen use that's talked about a lot, as well as hydrogen used to synthesize fuels. But we do include BECCS, H2 production, hydrogen and non-road and industry uses, as well as blended hydrogen into natural gas pipelines. So we're using the global change analysis model. That's an integrated assessment model which links the economy, energy, land use, water, and climate systems, running to 2100 in 5-year time steps. So here's our specific scenario matrix. So the 4 key cases are on the first left column. Basically, they're variations of supply and demand. So demand, we have a reference and we have a high demand case component, as well as a reference supply and advanced supply component. In terms of the demand assumptions, you can see that reference demand does not allow for blended hydrogen in this work, while high demand does. And then in terms of costs for industry and road transportation, we've got a reference set of cases for costs, as well as an advanced case, but we're still working on the actual advanced road transportation costs at the moment. And then in terms of non-road transportation, we do not make those technologies available in the reference demand world, but we do in the high demand. And similarly in supply, for reference supply, we've got a reference production cost and a higher cost for distribution associated with liquid H2 distribution. And advanced supply would include lower production costs, as well as lower distribution costs associated with gaseous delivery via pipelines. So these 4 scenarios we're gonna show results here for these scenarios consistent with 2 degrees Celsius warming by the end of the century using a carbon price. And we've also got a reference case which corresponds to the same set of assumptions as the first row here, but with no carbon price. So briefly looking at the levelized cost of hydrogen for 2050 for our model, you can see each technology here is represented with both the reference and then the advanced set of assumptions. The blue sections of the bar correspond to capital and O&M costs. The orange sections correspond to feedstock costs, and they do not include carbon prices or subsidies. And the gray sections of the bar correspond to distribution costs. And one of the big takeaways here is actually that, these gray sections of the bar are a pretty large component of overall cost for hydrogen production for many of these technologies. So switching between, the reference distribution and advanced distribution assumptions makes the large difference in overall levelized cost. Getting to our specific sectoral assumptions, we only allow for hydrogen in the building sector within the high demand scenarios, and this is via blended natural gas and hydrogen. We have a 20% hydrogen blend phased in by 2050. In industry, we do allow for hydrogen to be directly consumed in both, industrial energies, it's an aggregate sector in GCAM, as well as in cogeneration, and in cement process heat and fertilizer production. And then within the high demand scenarios, we've got a 25% cost reduction in hydrogen technologies by 2050, and we allow for the blending of hydrogen and gas to be used as well. And for transportation, we've got various hydrogen technologies represented. The key takeaway from this table is that total cost parity within the 2C reference supply high demand case is achieved for all technologies by 2075, except for international aviation. However, non-fuel cost parity is never achieved by any of these technologies. So turning to the results, we've got hydrogen consumption by sector here. In the top row, we've got the reference demand assumptions, the bottom row, the high demand assumptions. The first column would correspond to reference supply and the second column advanced supply. And you can kind of see that these blue and lighter red sections of the bars are kind of the larger consumers of hydrogen that corresponds to industry and freight road. And when we move from left to right, the big takeaway is that advanced supply assumptions are essentially doubling the amount of hydrogen consumed, so scaling up hydrogen consumption. But when we move from the top row to the bottom row, what we can see is that by allowing for the blended consumption is a large proportional consumer of hydrogen through mid-century, so that could be important for hydrogen producers at the beginning of the century. And then also allowing for hydrogen to be used in marine applications can increase overall demand towards the end of the century. And how does this compare to the IPCC scenario database? So this is the similar graph that we started off the presentation with, total final energy from hydrogen in the top left. And the big takeaway here is, hydrogen has a potential role to play between 3 and 11, or about 8% total final energy, is what we're modeling here with our green and orange scenarios. Those are the green and orange dots. And there's also a notable amount of hydrogen being used in industry in the bottom left, as well as in transportation in the bottom right. But the actual mix itself, same kind of grid here with reference demand on the top row, high demand on the bottom row, reference supply top on the left column, advanced supply right column. And you can see there's a lot of different production technologies that are in this mix. A large amount is coming from biomass plus CCS, as well as electrolysis, both grid and renewable. Yellow for grid, blue for renewable, and gas with CCS. But it seems that our various assumptions for supply and demand don't actually seem to impact the mix that's coming out here, mostly just the scale of production. And when we compare this to the IPCC database, turning back to hydrogen production, you can see that our advanced case is kind of the upper limit of these scenarios for all the various technology production methods, while our reference case scenarios are sort of on the middle to lower end of production versus the scenario database. So turning to conclusions here with the last few seconds, back to the motivating questions. How does the scale of hydrogen compare to other energy carriers? Well, electricity still provides the largest share of final energy across scenarios, but hydrogen still has, a potential role that it could play that's significant, 3 to 8% of total final energy, for instance, in 2050. And it's preferentially deploying in industry, heavy-duty transport, and also the blend is a large consumer before mid-century. And then the mix of this, as we just saw, there's various production technologies that could be playing a role in a hydrogen economy. So electrolysis, grid and renewable based, as well as biomass plus CCS and natural gas plus CCS. And how does this depend on assumptions about supply and demand? Well, it doesn't seem that production costs are significantly changing outcomes, including the mix, but the infrastructure assumptions for transmission and distribution are significantly affecting the scale of industrial and transportation demand. And also, allowing for hydrogen to compete in certain end uses, such as blending for buildings or marine applications, can increase overall demand for hydrogen. So there's definitely still some more work to do on this project. We have some additional sensitivities we'd like to include, such as a deeper decarbonization target, lower VRE costs, limited availability of biomass energy, limited availability of CCS, and also the availability of DAC. So thanks for tuning in, and happy to field any questions or feedback that you all have.
Thanks, Patrick. Right on schedule once again. I do note your emphasis at the end there on infrastructure as being important. It seems like a lot of these deep decarbonization options depend on at least complementary, if not leading infrastructure development. So I'd like to take a minute or two just on Patrick's talk. I don't know, Gunnar or Felix, if you're on, before we open it up for a final round of general questions, although we've had 25 great questions so far. So this time I'll call on Felix and let Gunnar do the wrap up on Patrick's talk. Felix.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick, for the great presentation. So I was wondering about the hydrogen cost of electrolysis in your modeling. So they were about, I think, $7 per kilogram hydrogen, which is quite high to kind of what I would have expected. Is what kind of assumptions do you make that affect the electricity price that the electrolysis sees in your model?
Right. So I guess that's a great question. A few reasons why that cost is kind of large here. Part of it is, the orange section of the bar is a reference case, so reference case and electricity price. So there's no kind of impact on the electricity prices associated with decarbonization versus the other technologies in the mix. And then also, that's good feedback too, because what we've done is not co-locate the grid electrolysis plants. So that's something that I think we're looking into, whether or not it should be sort of co-located to reduce the cost of electricity transmission and distribution. So that's great feedback.
Yeah, definitely. The co-location is one aspect, but the other aspect that we were also looking into is the question of like, how will taxes affect electrolysis in the future? Will they be taxed the same as normal electricity and stuff like this? And this is actually questions that we are also struggling with. So I think, but they affect quite a lot of the results.
Right.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Gunnar.
Great. Gunnar.
Along the same lines, maybe it's because Felix and I are part of the same bubble. In Germany and Europe, there's a big discussion about hydrogen, and general thinking is that there might at best be kind of a bridging role for fossil-based, what we call blue hydrogen, mostly natural gas.
Right.
But at some point, it will just lose out against renewable-based electrolysis, just because the pipeline of PV costs is just expected to continue to go down, and then we also expect quite substantial electrolysis learning effects once you go to like very large scales. So it's really, and that's why like I was very surprised to see your scenarios where you by 2050, 2100 still have like really a dominance of fossil-based hydrogen routes with CCS, which still have a bit of CO2 emissions because it's always imperfect the capture and so on. So maybe that's already answered the Felix's question, but you might have some thoughts about this, about the competition, and also the role of carbon pricing. Kind of the higher your carbon prices, the more you would maybe still shift away from the fossil-based routes.
Right. No, I think that's a great point too. That's part of the motivation for us looking into kind of an advanced case where there's lower VRE costs, that because I think that is a projected, high producer of hydrogen is, this renewable route of electrolysis. Yeah, it seems though from our results, more than 50% is coming from BECCS hydrogen, as well as renewable and grid electrolysis. And I think part of that is also kind of the desire to have negative emissions too in GCAM and other integrated assessment models. So that's a great point that we'll have to consider potentially in our main cases or also in our sensitivities. Does that help at all?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, totally.
Great, thank you.
Great. I now see, thank you very much, Patrick, and questioners. I now see we have 5 to 10 minutes for general questions, comments, maybe cutting across the different presentations. I found them to be actually artfully sequenced. I had nothing to do with the sequencing in a way to broaden the horizons and go even further into the future. But obviously it's just 6 excellent talks, so we didn't cover everything. Any additional questions on gaps, additional synergies, opportunities, including we ought to let the speakers weigh in on that now that they've seen what the other speakers have presented. Any new project ideas come out of this session? I could see it seemed like people were working on similar but not exactly the same things. I guess I do see now in the box one more on hydrogen from Alexander again. Alexander, do you want to ask your question, which I had actually thought about, but then forgot about?
It's just a simple question. What is the criteria for the blend in the case of the existing pipelines for Patrick? And how does this criteria evolves? Because as I understood, you have an evolution for the blend mandate, for the blend mix.
Right. So the 20% threshold was kind of taken from what we've seen in literature and from industry, that they think that that's a viable percentage of hydrogen that can come in. But we still phased this in kind of on the pipeline side as well, to allow for suppliers, the gas suppliers, to make the choice of whether or not it switches. So we didn't, automatically just allow the blend to just come in and be forced in. Sorry,
go ahead. Finish. Sorry.
No, that's mostly it. That's kind of the evolution we were looking at.
So is this using existing natural gas pipelines, or I know some people have talked about having little robots go through and coat the inside of the pipes to make them tighter to allow keeping the small hydrogen molecules within the pipeline system? Where did you go on the kind of technical fixes for the blending option?
Right. So we were considering really just utilizing existing structures, which is why it can't just penetrate every pipeline immediately and kind of takes transition over time.
Yeah, of course, out where I live, we have exploding natural gas pipelines with no hydrogen involved. So I'm sympathetic to the conservative, the realism perhaps of that assumption. Although in other areas that are rapidly growing, you could see new pipelines or some advanced technology solutions to reinforce the existing natural gas pipeline systems as they get built out.